Welcome back to In Conversations With. I'm Andrea Solana and I'm the head of advanced planning at MASECO Private Wealth. And in the last couple of years, we have really been focusing on women's wealth initiatives and beginning conversations with both our female clients and prospects to explore really interesting and important themes that are specific to women and the women's financial well-being. One of the topics that we wanted to explore is this concept of psychology of money and understanding the emotional relationship that women have with wealth. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to discuss this topic with you today. So I'm here with Holli Rubin, who is a psychotherapist and clinical mental health clinician with over 2 decades of experience speaking to individuals about kind of life transitions and understanding kind of financial and navigating financial well-being. So thank you, Holli, for joining us today. With this important topic, I'm really interested to explore with you your experience and why it's so important to speak about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me and inviting me into the conversation, Andrea. I have always been fascinated by the psychology of money and what does that actually mean? It means how we relate to money. It means how we feel about our financial situation that we're in, what we carry with us, and why it matters so much. And especially during these transitional times. I mean, transitions are challenging as it is, and things are stressful. When you throw money onto that into that equation, I should say, it can get even more challenging. So, something that I like to do in my practice, which not all therapists do, but I address money and I ask about. So I want to understand where people come from in terms of what their experience has been, what their early relationship with money has been, looking at these money scripts and money relationships. And they often happen really, really early on. So I'm always curious in my work to ask about when those ideas first came about, how they came about, how their parents discussed or didn't discuss money, and as a consequence, how they feel in their relationship to money.
That's really interesting. Do the clients ever kind of get taken aback at all in terms of the being asked that question, or is it something that they've often ever really thought about before?
It's a good question. Again, I think sure. Sometimes people get taken aback by it because they don't expect necessarily to be asked about that, or that it would even come into play as something that mattered necessarily. Whereas what you're doing, people come in and they expect to be helped with their finances. They might not necessarily expect to be asked about earlier, relationships or behavior around it. But from my standpoint, I think sometimes there is surprise. But what we start to do, and what I've realized, is that by not asking about that, we miss a lot of information, because our early relationships with money is very telling to who we grow up to be, and as a consequence, what role finances play in our lives, both with ourselves and money, as well as in our relationships going on. I think it's so interesting because what you offer by asking that question is you offer so much insight into your clients. Like, that's where our that's where our roles overlap a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And again, maybe not all, like you said, that client before that you had earlier today found it really helpful that that was posed to him, and he noticed that in other times he hadn't been asked that question. That gave you, I guess, that gave you so much information.
Yeah. I think sometimes clients come to us basically asking a question and thinking that that specific question just needs an answer,
Right.
But actually they're not asking the right question. And so by broadening the question that actually needs to be explored, it opens up kind of other topics of conversation and probably unearth areas from a psychology standpoint that, maybe they hadn't ever really thought about.
Absolutely. So what I say is that money is never really just about money. So there's always so much stuff underneath that in terms of, again, how we feel, what our relationships were like, what money symbolizes, how we grow up and create those ideas of our money mindset, of who do I want to be in the world, what kind of signifier does money represent and have for me. So all of those things, people might come into a session wanting to talk about one thing, but really, yes, that's, I guess, part of our jobs is, right, to uncover that a little bit, unearth some of what's really going on so that we can meet them and try to offer the most holistic sort of response.
Yeah. It does. It reminds me on kind of our side in the way that we approach kind of onboarding a client and getting to really understand their personal goals and objectives. We're very wealth planning led in the way that we approach discussions with clients. And in our very first meeting, which we call a discovery meeting with our clients, we ask all of the normal hard facts questions of kind of understanding the assets and liabilities and income and expenditure, what their goals and objectives are. But one aspect of that exploration process is really about actually digging into some of the soft facts. And one of the questions that we ask is, what does money mean to you? And to me, that kind of encapsulates that kind of trying to get at the heart of that psychology of money and kind of that emotional relationship that somebody might have with money. And it's really at the heart of kind of gathering that information because you just get a lot of personal information. Why do you think that kind of people's relationship with money is so personal and emotional?
I think that it's just a really heated topic. It's a real taboo topic. I think not for people who work in the space, right? Because it's just your normal daily parlance. But for others, I think this whole idea of money in general holds a lot of taboo. And discussing it and bringing it out to the fore is something that not everybody is comfortable with, definitely. And why? Because of old, outdated sort of views on what it meant, what role finances might have played in your family or didn't play, right? Where did you feel like you fit in terms of society based on what you had or didn't have? And again, it's not lost on me that culturally, North America, which obviously is where I'm from Canada, but have been here for 25 plus years. And culturally, how we deal with money is very different. And societies are stratified differently in North America than they are in the UK. And as a consequence, that too, money plays a role in that too. So I think there's a lot of, deep-seated challenge around that. And by asking those questions, not only do your clients discover things, but I think the information that you do garner from them really can help better put them in positions for challenging some of those biases that they might have.
Yeah. Do you find that kind of you think those challenges are different or bigger for women versus men, or do you think some of those are the same? What are your views?
Ooh, it's a question I love, because finances and female empowerment are really areas that I'm very interested in from a research standpoint, but also just in watching the changes too, and speaking from my generation and the generation that I was raised in, what that meant, what money meant, and what gender roles were established at the time, and what gender differences were, and what money was used in terms of as signifiers, and again, in more heteronormative, more conservative, potentially, couples, that we're looking at men being breadwinner and female being caretaker. People were entrenched in those roles, I would say. So changing those up and equalizing things is, and has always been, something that I've wanted to do, and feel so strongly about supporting women at their different stages in their lives. And how do we ensure that independence is had on both sides, and what women need from men in order to have that as well, so that the conversations are broader, and that we can assume we don't have to stay stuck in roles that are, outdated. And we have that, I think, here, right there. I don't know how many female advisors there are. Or, you can maybe tell me about that.
We certainly are focused on, trying to kind of grow that space a lot more. I think generally from a wealth management, financial services kind of space, it is still kind of largely dominated by men. But I think one of the focuses that we've had is really trying to change the conversation and break down kind of maybe some of the stigmas that might be attached to things that maybe would prevent a female from wanting to become a wealth manager. So, we currently have 2 female wealth managers other than myself. But in the kind of ranks of kind of coming through the front office department, it's probably pretty equal with respect to women and men that are considering kind of being wealth managers. And we've recently, in the last couple of years, made a real point from a mentoring perspective, actually, to sit down with some of the females around kind of the career paths. And for those who maybe are considering not wanting to, say, become a wealth manager, we try to dig into that a bit more to understand actually what it is that's, maybe trying to, or persuading them to kind of go in one direction, versus the other. Because I think sometimes there are preconceived notions that if you don't ask the questions, like if you're not naturally curious yourself, you might not actually realize that it might be a role that they'd actually thrive at and be good at. And I think also, especially here, because we are so planning led, and our role is kind of probably so far from actual true sales, versus some other maybe companies that are out there that actually some women may actually realize, what, this is actually more about relationship building, and it's more about kind of the hand-holding aspect and kind of some of those softer skills that actually they're much more naturally kind of inclined to do. And so I think we're having more success in kind of bringing up the next generation as well, and adding to that, which I think is really important, both from the perspective of kind of existing clients, but also, I'm sure everybody's seen the studies around, women, getting more and accumulating more wealth, over the years and will be inheriting more wealth. And women naturally live longer from a life expectancy standpoint. And so, in addition to gaining the independence, there's just naturally also going to be more women who need the help. And, having more women giving financial advice as well is, I think, naturally going to benefit, the industry in terms of kind of changing how those conversations are led, and kind of what's important.
Absolutely. That's so important. I remember reading a research piece around the fact that I had done some work with a trust company, and the research, I'm not sure if it was out of that company, but the time showed that in a session, in an advisory session, there would be a couple, let's say, and in this particular case, a woman was in finance, husband was not. Woman was responsible for the finances in her home, and yet in that advisory session, the woman would cede to the husband, the male partner. And isn't that just, I remember really being astonished by that, because it was just so telling of the dynamic that is present, right? Now it was several years back, and I'm hoping that's evolving and changing. But the question was, did it have to do with just being with an advisor who might have expected that, or what were they playing out, right, in that session and in that assessment session? But it really struck me that regardless of the woman's expertise, there was a need to sort of hold back and not to defer, exactly, to not share what she knew in that setting. And it sort of raised a bit of an alarm bell at the time, which was like, well, how do we ensure that that doesn't have to happen, and she could have her voice? And because clearly, I mean, they have those conversations at home, but there was something in experience that didn't allow her to feel entitled to be able to speak up as they generally do.
Yeah. I think
do you see that?
Yeah, it's so important, I think, from the standpoint of there might be that natural tendency to kind of defer or take that step back. But as part of our roles as advisors, it's important to ensure that the kind of conversation is opened up to a point that both people sitting in the room feel comfortable kind of responding. And I think if you see a dynamic where one person is kind of, trying to kind of, dominate the conversation and the way that questions are answered, I think it's always important to try to redirect it specifically to the other person to try to get them to open up as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've definitely also, outside of experience, seen kind of the studies of that show kind of that women tend to do that, both kind of in the dynamics of their own relationship, but also even if it's a woman sitting with a male advisor, them tending to, defer to what the male is trying to say to them. And it's important to try to build up the kind of confidence in feeling like actually they can kind of own that relationship. And it's probably part of the reason too why in life transitions there is so often kind of money and movement that happens, with respect to financial advisor relationships. If women are widowed or maybe in a divorce kind of scenario, if they haven't been properly engaged in that financial relationship previously, more often than not, they're going to basically seek out, a new advisor relationship where they can at least try to regain that dynamic. And I think from a wealth management industry standpoint, it's something that everybody really needs to actually focus on, because if more wealth is going to be put in the hands of women over the next decade or two, and those life transition events are happening and people aren't properly servicing them, then, that's money that is just going to kind of walk out the door.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's definitely very, very relevant and important to try to kind of make sure that conversation is directed
for sure
to kind of both people who are sitting.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just thinking about how much earlier though those conversations have to begin, right? Like this idea of emotional literacy for women, where doesn't that need to start so much earlier, and where, right? Does that conversations at school, that conversations at home? How do these things get discussed openly or behind closed doors? Because it's not the woman's fault sitting in that situation, in that there are biases that are there. There's a lack of confidence, perhaps. There's assumptions that are being made left, right, and center about what that position is. And yet, I remember when we did our panel talk, right? How many people walked out of there afterwards saying, oh my God, I better get my SIP. I better get this. I don't have that. I'm not set up for this.
Yeah.
And it was women. It was all women. And they realized just how much more engaged they need to become. And that was really important to see and understand that there are people, such as yourself, who do this and help them so that they can feel more comfortable to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. I do think that the conversation does need to start a lot earlier. But I was also kind of heartened recently to see that there was some work being done around kind of pension gap. And, that's obviously a big conversation. You could kind of go down that road of, that happens when women are taking time out of work, or whether that's with children or, elderly caregiving or just, career break, etc. And the exercise that was done was around a group of, I think they were maybe like 6 or 7 years old. And they were given slices of cake. There was kind of a cake that was cut up, and there was a little kind of cover put over each slice of cake that was given to the little boys and girls. And then they later kind of opened it, and the little girls had smaller slices of the cake than the little boys. And they basically made a learning point around kind of the idea of like the pension kind of gap that can happen kind of later on because of those typical traditional gender roles. And all of the boys were like, no, that's really not fair. And they really kind of, went to bat, and stood up about it. And, obviously that's kind of a very kind of small example, but it's something that at that age can probably leave an impressionable, opinion and lasting in terms of fairness and equality and what should be looked at kind of on a go forward basis. And, I think little things like that, introducing concepts early will help, in addition to kind of everything else.
Absolutely. And the concrete nature of actually seeing, two slices side by side, one belonging to women or girls and one belonging to the boys, and just how obvious that was.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful. But I also think that we're losing so much of those tokens, if you will, concrete examples of what money is or means or can do for you, right? Like I remember when my kids were really small, this notion of the piggy bank that I really insisted on having because I needed them to understand what it meant to put money in there and to have something.
Yeah.
Because the concept of money and finances is so... It's just completely foreign to young children, even to adults, right? But this concept is so vague. What does it mean? Which is why we do need to concretize it, understand from a flow chart or whatnot, what it can do, what it can bring to you, so that you can begin to develop your values around that, having money doesn't necessarily bring you, as we know, happiness, success. A rich life is not defined necessarily by what's in your bank account.
Yeah.
What can it bring you are things that I'm always asking about. But I'm really, drawn to this idea of making it concrete so that we can, lest we forget, right? That's the thing. You go to a bank, how often do you go and tap on something? You don't feel it leaving your account. You don't understand the ramifications the same way that you did. Sorry, when you look in your wallet and notice, wow, I only have, 10 quid on me. Wow, I'm better do something about that.
Yeah.
How do you see that in terms of moving forward, right? We're going to have less and less concrete indicators of money, what's going to be.
Yeah. I mean, well, one of the things that we think is really important kind of with our clients is also just touching on that and going back a little bit to kind of the whole teaching kind of principles early. We've really started to focus on kind of bringing clients' children into the conversation in, say, their maybe university years or kind of post-university years. And it differs, I think, in terms of kind of the roles that your clients are comfortable with their children playing at different points in time. But we start with financial education, first and foremost, and just trying to teach them basic concepts of, personal finance and things like, what a stock and bond is, or kind of, even the idea of kind of budgeting and, trying to put money into maybe an ISA or something like that. So that in and of itself, I guess it doesn't necessarily, help per se with kind of the tangible day-to-day kind of spend, but the budgeting aspect certainly does. But it helps to just kind of lay the groundwork of kind of financial independence and kind of thinking about money in a more mature way. But one of the other areas that we really encourage clients to kind of think about doing is, to the extent that in their broader financial, planning, they maybe want to think about, philanthropic activities or charitable giving, that we often encourage that, if that's part of the goals, to make that more of a family affair, because that can be a really, really good way to pass on, foundational, things that are important from a family foundational standpoint, and kind of build more of a legacy. And it's also then, getting the children to be able to take some ownership over kind of where maybe some money is directed. Helps them to actually start thinking about the meaningful impact of that. And that's maybe money, obviously, that's not going to be theirs personally, but it has an emotional attachment to it, and can help get them involved, separate from the idea of actually maybe giving them money to kind of work with themselves. Just depending on when gifting and things like that might become part of the conversation. But we've found that clients have been really interested and engaged in kind of approaching that sort of strategy, because it's also a way to connect, and keep the family kind of engaged.
I know there was a lot of conversation amongst our demographic and our friend group around, well, okay, we're sending children to uni now, kids to uni. They haven't had a budget thus far. Nobody has really taught, per se, what do we do? How do we do this? How do they learn that, okay, here's a sum of money. How are you going to allocate? How are you going to spend it over the next term? How do you choose to plan that together? I think is a really interesting idea, and something that no one does. But I think everybody would probably benefit from.
Yeah. I think one of the things I advocate for in kind of that area is actually around kind of, if for instance, kind of what rent is going to be payable, and generally kind of obviously what books and all of that sort of stuff kind of costs. is giving like per semester or whatever kind of a sum of money and saying this is what this has to cover, and it's up to you to basically make that work. And so there's some stuff in there for kind of fun and discretionary spending, but you have to basically work that out yourself. And surely there's instances where they mess up and maybe they spend more than they, but that's part of the learning experience. And
exactly. But again, just having that dialogue, I think, is super important, and I don't see necessarily having everywhere.
We've covered loads of topics so far, and a lot of what we're talking about really can be applicable to both males and females, and we know it can be kind of sensitive to talk about kind of females specifically, but it really is incredibly important. And I'm curious from your perspective, kind of why it is so important actually to make that separate distinction, to kind of think about the psychology from a female perspective.
Yeah. And again, I think the reason why we're needing to think about things differently is because it has been different. Okay. And as much as it's sometimes painful to go back historically to understand why it's that way, we need that context in order to understand how we can improve things going forward. So that's the goal, right? The goal is that there isn't that difference, and that girls and boys, men and women are treated equally, are paid equally. There aren't those gaps that we're still continuing to fight. But we have to be honest and recognize historically that men were seen as the provider and the designator and the one who goes out and kills for the meals and brings it back and goes back to the cave. And I mean, this is old and historical. So that had a place, and now we're no longer in that same experience. So how do we make sure that things are equalized? So again, with man as provider and designator, making money, bringing home the bacon, power, status, wealth, all of that those words tended to be associated with a man. And the woman had other stereotypes that she fulfilled, such as caretaker and homemaker and cook and, dressmaker, and all of those things that were really clearly delineated, whether they are fair, not fair, whether she was good at those roles and he was good at those roles. It just was. And so what we're working on now is trying to pull away from those to make sure that whoever is better at the task should be the one who's doing the job. But we know that that's still not necessarily happening. I think it even goes back. I'm literally going back to class and math class. What happened in math class is when you'd have in North America, they tended to be mixed classes. They weren't divided. School wasn't divided necessarily between girls and boys. And in those mixed classes, there were lots of research done around asking questions. Who do the questions get asked? Who puts up their hand? If boys and girls put up their hands to answer a math question, who does the teacher choose? Do they tend to choose boy over girl? Yes. Do girls over time stop putting their hands up because they feel that they're not going to be chosen? Yes. So all of those things did happen. And that's when girls develop their sense of agency, their sense of a voice, their facility with numbers. There are lots of stats that show that, in the earlier days, that boys tended to do better in math and physics and sciences, which is why we have this whole push for STEM, right? And we know and see that, in fact, they didn't necessarily do better, but there was something else going on, which I've just described. How we get away from those is by looking at them and not just canceling and not talking about it, but understanding that it had a place at a time and that now it no longer is that. And we're looking at universities and numbers are astounding. Again, it's the girls who are carrying on. It's, I think now it was at 60-40%, right? But now I don't know if that's still shifting, but women are running with it. And all of this help towards female empowerment has done a lot of its job. We're not fully there yet.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I'm sure, Andrea, you'll see this generationally. How are women approaching, life and sharing responsibilities and young children? How is all of that taking place in younger generations? And are we walking the walk? And, are we dividing labor at home and in the workplace?
Yeah. I think in many respects, it is shifting, and that conversation is a more open conversation. And generationally, I think it is being addressed, a bit better, but there's still very kind of interesting dynamics at play because, as you alluded to, from an education perspective, women are largely more educated now than men. And from kind of a working standpoint, are starting out equal, in terms of kind of the types of roles and pay and all of that. And it is as you get further down the line where those differences and gaps actually really start to show up. And it does tend to be really around the points in time that women have to take breaks to say have a child. I saw something recently around a highlight around a male and a female who graduated from kind of a good university with the same amount of debt from like a student loan perspective, had the same salaries kind of at the starting point. And the female woman was actually progressing kind of better for a number of years and was working to kind of make pension contributions and pay down the loan. And then, at around, say, age 30, she had a child, took a year off, came back, didn't get, say, a pay rise, in that period, wasn't paying off her loan in that period, wasn't making a pension contribution in that period, came back for a year, and then, went off maybe a year or two later again, and was in that period also maybe only working part-time type of thing. But essentially it just highlighted that a 5-year kind of slowdown period, not even necessarily completely removing themselves from work, actually created a gap in terms of progression from a promotion standpoint, from a repayment of loan standpoint, from a pension contribution standpoint, that just was never able to be made up, even in kind of the years of kind of working full time again, and doing very well. And so, from a dynamics at home standpoint, just kind of returning to that side of equation, I think actually probably the most progress has been made, I would say, from a generational standpoint in that regard. I think a lot of fathers are incredibly engaged in kind of the day-to-day at home and helping to take care of the children, and equally just even more probably engaged in sharing the load of kind of household chores.
Sure.
But there are things that just still tend to disproportionately impact women more than men, probably more outside of the home. And that's kind of happening, more from kind of I think in the professional kind of world. And I think what's interesting to me is, there's kind of a push, maybe to kind of equalize, say, paternity, kind of leave, or, have more of an opportunity for maybe men to take a break. As well. Yeah. And some bigger companies are offering that. But how many people take it up?
Exactly.
And then equally, if you don't have enough people kind of taking it up, then, you're not actually shifting anything from an overall perspective.
Yeah.
So you do still then tend to see kind of, women ending up deferring a bit more in those traditional roles.
Yeah.
Also because of the cost of childcare.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. So that plays such a role also, right? Because often the cost of care is so great that what often happens is someone decides, okay, you know what, if you're going to be earning more, then perhaps I'll stay home. Now, sometimes that's the male partner, sometimes it's the female. Often it was more in my day where a lot of the women said, you know what, I'm just going to stay home, and it just doesn't make sense financially. But what ended up, what I saw a lot is that decision might have been a joint decision, but what ended up happening is that by not bringing in an income, the value and the self-worth was diminished as a consequence of that. So this problem with, equating self-worth with net worth is something that, I uncover a lot with my clients, because it's real that, I'll have this repeated conversation that, I don't know, I'm home, I'm doing, laundry, I'm busy up and down the stairs and back and forth and activities, or walking around the corner, just trying to get out of the house a little bit, come back and I have a sink full of dishes and, 2 more piles of laundry that have not been done. And I'll get the question of, well, I don't, like, what did you do all day? And the mom will break down and feel like, I know I have been busy from 6 a.m. till, 10 o'clock at night. And yet that's what I have to show for my work. And it was such a confronting experience often, because they were just feeling horrible about themselves, about their roles, about not contributing to society. In my world, a parent who is home on a daily and is reliable and can go and drop off and pick up and have support as well around them enables a secure attachment that happens between child and caretaker. And that is hugely important. And while that might not show up on the balance sheet, that shows up in the confidence that you build and develop in your child and in the relationships that he or she might be able to take out into the world. So it's always a hard one when I see that.
Well, and it sounds like, kind of in your experience from kind of a therapist standpoint, that's coaching that you have had to kind of do with some women to build that confidence. Is that accurate?
And to recognize their self-worth, that what they are doing is incredibly valuable and important for those reasons. Again, you might not be contributing financially at that time, but what you're contributing is your time, your energy, your effort, and what you're giving back to your child is worth a lot more sometimes than the small income that you might be earning. So that it's a decision well made. But having that mind shift is what's really important to get the mom to actually see that what I'm doing is of so much value, and it's the fault is of society for not recognizing that value, as opposed to, the materialism that we tend to focus on.
Yeah. Outside of kind of the feelings of self-worth and kind of those scenarios that you've seen, have you also seen kind of any sort of anxiety around kind of how they're able to kind of maybe not access maybe the wealth of the family, but do they feel any sort of I don't know if shame is the right word, but like in terms of their
lack of contribution?
Yeah. And do they have a right to actually kind of participate
Absolutely.
in the use of that?
Comes up a lot. So almost as soon as the earning power is diminished, then that comes up, which is like, wait, despite the fact that I am primary caretaker, there is a resistance to thinking that they are part of this game. And that has to be discussed between the couple, because it might not be the case. The woman might feel that way, but the partner might very well not feel that way. So that there's, a narrative that's created, that's repeated, assuming that that's how he feels, but that might not necessarily be the case. So the tip there is to always just be as open as you can with the feelings that you're having. If you don't know what you're having, if you can't really articulate the feelings, we'll get some help with that. Be that professional help, talk to a friend, talk to a parent, a mentor, in trying to just make sense of that for yourself, and then be able to have a conversation, because we know that just because she's not working at that time does not mean that she's not entitled to be aware, be savvy, be involved in all of those financial decisions.
Yeah. It's interesting because I guess from our side of kind of the equation in our role, we probably often see this maybe in a later scenario of kind of maybe if the relationship breaks down and the woman now actually is in a scenario where she's on her own and maybe she's gained a share of kind of that wealth that she needs to manage. And it's, we have an opportunity at that point to work with the dynamics of kind of building that confidence and kind of really drilling down on what's important to her. But I'm wondering, outside of that scenario, because that's obviously far down the line if that even happens. But I'm wondering within the scenario of kind of the dynamics of that relationship, and maybe if we're sitting across the table with that couple and talking about their financial goals, and kind of a lot of that conversation is around kind of maybe the different types of spend, or overall level of spend in terms of their planning. But I guess short of trying to engage, say, her in terms of kind of speaking about what goals and objectives are really important to her, do you think there are any other ways for us to kind of try to get at the heart of whether she might be feeling that way? I think, like, obviously in a therapy scenario, she would be sitting with you and kind of it would naturally kind of come up. But that is kind of such a personal kind of thing that probably wouldn't necessarily, even if we're asking about what money means to her, sometimes something like that might not actually come out. Yeah.
Sometimes it's in the subtleties, right? Sometimes it's in the body language. Sometimes it's being attuned to whoever's sitting in front of you, right? And empathizing with, again, through their histories, understanding what their journey has been. And how they might experience even it's I think it can be really intimidating sitting in a scenario with an advisor who's like, okay, tell me everything you have, tell me where it comes from, what was it like growing up with your parents. I mean, all of that can be very full on and charged, right? So I guess the goal is to be disarming with those things and notice. How are they coming to the table with these conversations? Are they forthcoming? Are they more reserved? If they're more reserved, might it require a second session of that? Do you need to break it down and do less in one go? Is it helpful sometimes to have a separate session with each partner as well as a joint one, where maybe one of the, maybe if it's the female, she can talk more openly, perhaps in that case, so the more you learn, the more you have to be able to help her and the couple with. I think the more information you have, the better.
Yeah,
and not everybody is as forthcoming. Again, culturally, I see that a lot too.
Yeah,
different cultures feel differently, A, about money, and B, about the way one communicates about it. So as an advisor, as a wealth manager, I guess having that sensibility, knowing who's coming and who's sitting in front of you, what they might be comfortable with or less comfortable with, I think also gives you a whole lot of information.
Yeah.
How they're speaking, how they're sitting, how they where they place themselves, whether they're deferring to their partner. All of that tells you, you know, have they had education? Did they do this growing up? You know, breaking down their, you know, money mindset, looking at it from a behavioral health standpoint. I think all of that gives you information.
Yeah. How have you found, kind of switching gears a little bit, how have you found kind of maybe any, subtle or stark differences between kind of women that you've spoken to and maybe how their money has originated in terms of how they feel or experience kind of their wealth, or maybe anxieties that they might experience? Obviously, we spoke a little bit about, you know, kind of some of the self-worth kind of conversations that might come into play if, you know, the woman is maybe a homemaker for, you know, a period of time or a long period of time. But, you know, in the scenarios where maybe, you know, a woman grows up with money and has always had it versus, you know, somebody who inherited money at a specific point in time, you know, versus, you know, kind of, you know, somebody who's maybe had a very successful career and has more self-made money. Have you seen kind of very different dynamics or thoughts about kind of their emotional relationship with money in those scenarios?
Yes, I have noticed differences, certainly. I think someone who has grown up with money, assuming that there has been transparency around conversation, I think the accommodation towards that is easier because it's something that they have comfort with. I've noticed in thinking about certain clients that, you know, having just come into money, that is almost in a similar way to like a young actor or a young singer, that coming into stardom, that coming into a space that's foreign where supposedly it's an exciting time, I think can also be very overwhelming and can bring up all sorts of feelings around, you know, guilt and shame and discomfort around identity and who am I now if all of a sudden I've inherited wealth. Or whereas if somebody has grown up with money, they don't necessarily question that the same way because it's something that they've just been living more naturally. And then, you know, and then what actions come up or what circumstances come up with somebody who has just come into money, let's say, or inherited? How do they decide what do they decide and how to do? I've seen a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about that, very guilty. And that's not about them having a strange response or a different kind of response. It's about what society says about affluence and wealth, as opposed to what might happen to them. They question their values sometimes as a result of that. And that can be a positive thing too, in that they might want to be more philanthropic, or they might make different decisions and might take planning more seriously than they might have had they not.
Yeah.
What about you? Does that happen too?
Yeah, I mean, I think too the other aspect that, you know, sometimes can, you know, play in from my perspective is also whether it's you know, something that's completely unexpected, or whether they were aware of this eventuality. And I think that can sometimes factor into kind of how people experience it, because I think in the scenarios where, you know, maybe they kind of were either part of the conversation earlier on before it happened and kind of knew at some point this would come into play, versus, you know, just kind of getting a phone call one day and saying, you know, this is yours type of thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's the amount of preparation and kind of, you know, ability to kind of, you know, become more comfortable with it, or maybe even plan, you know, for a period of time of what that might look like.
And do you have those conversations with clients in that scenario whereby you encourage family members to have those conversations and to actually do planning with incorporating family members?
Yeah.
Should that be on the
Yeah,
horizon?
definitely. I think on both sides of the equation, where we have older clients that you maybe have, children, obviously that would be, say, inheriting kind of wealth or maybe giving wealth. It's kind of talking about how to bring them into that process in a way that they're comfortable with, but also kind of prepares the next generation. I think that's especially important for two reasons, both from a kind of planning standpoint for the next generation, but also, from a relationship financial advisor kind of standpoint, bringing the next generation into the conversation also helps solidify that transitional event, and hopefully helps kind of the scenario where maybe the wealth isn't going to kind of move away at that point in time. But also the scenarios where actually maybe the children are the ones who are our clients and the parents are not, and so they're not really part of the equation. But the children are thinking, or maybe they know that their parents are actually going and having conversations, but they're not aware of what those conversations are. We often encourage kind of trying to open that conversation, and again, even if the parents aren't our clients, maybe encourage a scenario where to see if the parents would be willing to be part of a broader conversation. Again, that's kind of two parts as well, both from a kind of planning standpoint, but also it can be especially important from a niche standpoint of where we kind of focus on, say, US and UK families, because so often from just a broader tax planning perspective, what the parents might do can, severely impact from a negative standpoint on kind of actually how the next generation receives what they're, trying to pass on. And more often than not, they want that to be as efficient as possible, and they might not be aware of some of those issues.
It makes me think also, like some things that come up on my end around the psychology is of wealth or of affluence is, and a lot of parents worry about this, that what happens if, children from wealthy families just, assume that there are finances there, and that becomes something that is a demotivator, right? That's something that has come up quite a bit with, either having inherited from a family member or just having done self-made and having done really well. The last thing they want to do as parents is to impinge on the growth of the success of their children. Success meaning that it's not necessarily associated with financial wealth, but how does one live a successful life after they have come into a lot of money, let's say.
Yeah. I think that's really important to explore as well, from the standpoint of just really understanding actually what success looks like and what that means. And for everybody, in the same way that money can mean, something different, success can mean something different, and kind of understanding that and how that factors into the overall puzzle.
Which is why I like to separate the two, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, wealth and materialism also are two different things. So how do we define all of that is helpful, I think, in those scenarios.
Thank you, Holli, so much for taking the time to sit down and speak with us today. I think we've covered loads of topics around this theme of kind of the psychology of money, and how that really impacts the emotional relationship specifically for women. And I think there's a lot of takeaways for us to kind of think about as we sit down and approach these personal financial planning conversations with our clients, to really kind of think about and help kind of add to the depth of the relationship that we have with our clients. So we will absolutely take that away and try to enhance the service that we are delivering to our clients.